Welcome to Work Life by Design. I'm your host, Mel Marsden. If the last few years have taught us anything, it's that change is inevitable and we no longer need to go to work to work. As a workplace dynamic strategist and the founder of Community, I draw back the curtains on my own business, the clients and projects that we deliver, along with tapping into the knowledge and insights from academics, business leaders and champions of change. I believe that our environments have the power to positively influence our behaviour and performance, inspiring our human potential. As organisations are navigating this new landscape of hybrid work, a conversation that's happening more and more is one that's centering around how do we work and how do we want to work before we start talking about what does our office actually look like. Now, today's guest, Dan Mottau, did just that. So Dan was actually introduced to me by a mutual colleague when I was looking for thought leaders in the people and culture space to join me for my book launch panel in Melbourne. And from the first conversation that I had with Dan, I was completely blown away with his approach to work and to workplace. This was someone who spoke my language and absolutely understood the impact of how a workplace design needs to respond to the operations of the business. So much so that when the opportunity arose for Dan and the team at Redbubble to create a new workplace, rather than jumping straight out and heading to market and chatting with leasing agents about what were the properties available, they took a moment and they started to really think about how do we want people at Redbubble to work? Now, that simple question sent them off on a journey that completely transformed the way that they work, but then also the place that would be best to support that way of working. Now, that simple question set them off on a journey that completely transformed not only the way that they worked, but then also the place that would best support that way of working. So today I've invited Dan to join me here for a conversation to share what really is a progressive, insightful, and in some ways quite a radical approach to the whole process, and one that I would welcome more organisations to consider when embarking on the opportunity of creating a new workplace. To first really question the nature of work, the way their people work, and then what they truly want from their workspace to facilitate and enable that work. And what I find fascinating about this approach is that it was a people-led approach. As Dan shares with us, the project lead was their head of DBI. This was not a project that was handed down to the facilities team from the finance team. It was entrusted to the people teams to deliver, hiring in the support that they needed when they needed it. Now, this is an approach that I really want to highlight, as taking this approach to creating your next workplace will lead your business to creating a very different outcome. An outcome that puts your people at the center and a focus on creating a space that optimizes the performance of your people, not just the performance of your building. Now, to give you a bit of background on Dan, he's a senior people, organizational development, learning and communication leader who enjoys examining the underlying motivations and patterns of thinking that elicit amplifying and diminishing behaviors within and between teams. His approach is heavily influenced by behavioral psychology and anthropology, especially as their principles may be applied to team functioning and the cultivation and sustainment of psychological safety and high performance. With a passion for accelerating the growth of leaders and for increasing their personal impact through the success of their people. And as you're going to hear him say today, he is a people geek, which I absolutely love. And he's going to talk about how all of these factors come together. And it's not just about place, but it's about leadership, it's about organizational structure, and all of the factors that make this successful. So without any further ado, let's jump into today's conversation. So I am joined with Dan here today. Thank you so much for joining me, Dan, and welcome to the podcast.
Pleasure. Thanks, Mel. Good to be here.
So look, Dan, I've already given people a bit of a rundown on who you are and how we came to be. So what I'm really keen to do is just get straight in and understand a little bit more about your background and how you came to start designing the idea of work before you started looking at designing workplace. Now, to put some context on that, we've gone through a process of, we identify workplaces. We know that we need to create a new workplace, whether that's a lease expiry or something else that's coming up. But, from the experiences that you've had and the work that you've done in the past, you guys didn't start there by running out and starting to look for a leasing agent and, looking at what all your property options were and going, okay, well, we've got this many people and how are we going to squeeze them into this smaller box? You guys took a bit of a different approach. So I'd be keen for you just to talk us through that and what really inspired that approach.
Yeah, I suppose there's two pieces. There's my personal philosophy and how that aligns with the work that I've done with different employers. And I know Redbubble is an example that I'll lean on for this particular conversation quite a lot. But starting with that philosophy, I think fundamentally, I am a people person. I'm a people geek. I got into my line of work because I care about people. I want to see them grow. I want to see them perform. I want to see them succeed. I want to see them promoted and be mobile through an organization, through their career. So it just seems logical to me that we start with the person, which is to understand, what do these people need? What is the environment that they need to be successful? And I know the buzz term human-centered design is the new sort of terminology that we apply across this thing. But for me, it's just common sense. It is just fundamentally, have we asked enough questions to understand what makes this group of individuals, this group of teams perform well and feel well and be well? And everything is built around that, in my view. I suppose where that then intersects with my work, and I'll use Redbubble as the example to begin, is that they too are an organization that puts people first. It's a marketplace for art and artists fundamentally. And that's putting the great works, the great innovations, the great thinking, creativity of artists at the forefront. And that spills into the people experience, which is that we put people first to enable that marketplace to help artists bring their works to life. And that's obviously a very exciting proposition. It's a very easy proposition to get excited by and get behind. But that culture does sort of spill through to the way you work, the way you think about work as well. So when we started this conversation, and for Redbubble, it was largely accelerated by COVID-19, we were at an interesting point in time where we were looking at two of our key hub offices in Australia, one in the United States and Berlin. So there were three key offices. And we were at a time where we were looking at either a new office location or a refresh. And then what sort of caused us to rethink and sort of just start with a blank slate was, well, the notion of what work is has just changed within 2 weeks. It was day one, Monday, we might be having to move to a remote setting soon for safety and our well-being, to less than a week or so later, we're now all from home all the time. So the conversation just got bigger. And it allowed us to start from scratch, which is not just say, well, we're looking for a new office. What could that office look like? It was, well, how are people going to work? So we had to have these sort of day one, day two, day three concepts in mind, which is, well, in a peri-COVID state where we're still in and out of lockdowns, well, what does that look like? In a somewhat peri or post-COVID state, well, what does that look like? And where do we imagine we're going to be in 3, 4, 5 years? And we had to ask those questions first. So there were dozens of design questions that were all related to what is the experience of that person, that team on that day? How does it help them perform? How does it help them be well at work and do their best work?
That's a pretty progressive approach that you guys have taken there, because I know, firsthand from the experience that I have with working with clients is that they don't take that approach. They'll go, okay, our lease is expiring. We have this many people. We've got a projected growth of that. Let's go out to market and we think we need about this much space. COVID did completely challenge our whole way of understanding what work is, how we work, where we work. But this is a project that you guys embarked on a few years ago. This isn't happening now. Like, I'm only having these conversations with many clients now. So to be that forward thinking and to have jumped in and approached this project that early on, what was really sparking that? Was that driven by you? Was it driven by the team? Were there some business drivers that started that progress? What really sparked that off?
Well, I hate to say it, but it's all of it. It's a push and pull from all directions. There are the expectations of the executive and the board. And I must say, of the boards and executives I've worked with, this has to be one of the most people-focused boards and executives I've ever worked with. It was genuinely impressive. But it also comes down to the team you build around the project itself. So we weren't a project team predominantly of accountants and people with predominantly workplace and safety and traditional OH&S, for instance, backgrounds. It was a very diverse team to begin with. As I shared at your wonderful book launch, the project lead was our head of DIEB. And that instantly brings a different lens to what this work is. If your project lead's priority is people's sense of belonging and wellness at work, their sense of inclusivity in the environment and together, then you're asking different questions from day one. We also had the benefit of a chief people officer, Vanessa, who brought me into Redbubble, who is also a people geek like us, a person who cares deeply about people, but also has that very important balance of pragmatism and people centrism. And then as we built the project team out, we brought the CFO in, Emma, at the time, and we had this very balanced team, each with a particular focus area, but who shared very similar values about people and the value of people. We ended up in this position where the majority of our design questions that we were asking of our workforce, of our board and executive, of our leadership team was predominantly focused on what is the optimal state we can design. And then we bring in constraint. And then the reality of that timing too, and this was in March, April, May, and beyond 2020, as we were still grappling with what this was going to be, the commercial real estate market also dropped. The floor dropped out completely, especially as we got to the end of the year when we were starting to engage with agents to look at spaces. The incentives and the actual per square meter cost of these floor plates had just gone through the floor, no pun intended. So not only were we looking at a massive increase in space quality and facility quality, but we were looking at it a much lower per square meter basis. So the CFO Emma was absolutely delighted. So in terms of optionality and looking at the optimal versus the realistic, the overlap, if it were a Venn diagram, was almost complete. We had these incredible choices, partly due to the situation we found ourselves in. And that was true in Melbourne and in Berlin, where we were looking at two different spaces to take out new leases and move our teams. And the same was partly true in San Francisco, where we were refurbishing an existing space. So we had a lot of the conditions working in our favor. So when it came to some of those more simple questions that people tend to start with, which is how many seats do we need? We kind of had the choice. We kind of had that conversation where we thought, well, we could bring down the space and increase other benefits, working from home benefits, which we also did. But we also had the choice to say, well, do we want to have one seat per person? Or do we want to create neighborhoods which are based on a particular ratio of who we expect to be in a space? And it gave us essentially the option of doing either. And that was an incredibly lucky position to be in based on the cost at the time and the incentives provided by landlords at the time to bring people in when other businesses were moving out. We were incredibly lucky. So I would say a lot of it was certainly down to that people-centered thinking, but we were certainly aided by the conditions of the market at the time.
Yeah. And I think what was really interesting about what you just said then is that the team that were leading this project, not once did you mention anyone from facilities. Not once did you mention anyone with some sort of property background. So I think from the outset, you had a people-centered team leading this project. And as you said, it created a very different dynamic. It created a very different focus, but you still produced a very productive outcome that was centered on the people that work there, but it was also managed in a cost-efficient delivery. And not one of you needed to have a property or facilities background to execute on this project. It was still an ability to deliver that project and highly successfully.
Yeah, I would say, to be fair, across the members of that project, a number of us, including myself, including our CFO, CPO, and our head of DIB, have done office moves and relocations before. So yes, whilst there wasn't that formal qualification, that formal role within the business, I would call out that a head of DIEB, Dom, was also historically a workplace experience specialist. And he oversaw Redbubble's workplace experience. So I think it's fair to say, yes, there wasn't anyone with that traditional workplace facilities background, but there were a number of people on that panel, all of us, in fact, who had experience and exposure to developing good workplace experiences. And I think very much to your point, not having had that traditional background and sort of coming up through the workplace experience background, it allowed us to ask different questions and focus on different things without perhaps the blinkers of having that experience.
Yeah, I think you're right there. And thank you for clarifying that, because it's interesting to know that there's that historical experience there. But as you said, it's not that traditional approach, because it's a very different set of questions and it's a very different process and methodology that would be applied coming at it. But I think what's also good about that is that it just demonstrates that that mix of skill set and that mix of focus can produce really productive, successful, financially sound outcomes for a business as well, compared to what the traditional model is of bringing the facilities team and maybe asking the people and culture team to contribute to that process. So my next question for you is really around understanding what some of the core drivers were in defining this process. I mean, you've taken a very people-centered approach, but no doubt there were some key objectives and, core drivers that were underpinning the delivery of this whole project. Do you want to just take us through those?
it's a bit of a blur because it was such an unusual time. But look, I think fundamentally we had early on some limitations around financials. Again, heading into this period in COVID, and I'm sure almost all businesses are in this space just asking that question, where will we be in 6, 12, 18 months financially? What will this thing that we don't understand do to our sustainability as an organization, our financial sustainability as an organization? There were certainly financial drivers of this. So we had limits on what our budget would be, and those were very clearly defined limits. We were, as I said, though, in the Redbubble example, well aided by the market conditions at the time. The other pieces were factors we were examining around the organization itself, around what people wanted and what people were missing historically. So it wasn't just a question of what do you want for the future? It was also spending some time to examine where people had been in the past and where they felt the workplace was a great place to be, a great place to learn, a great place to collaborate, to be with people, socialize, develop a sense of belonging, and not just assuming we throw all that out. So we spent a lot of time surveying from pre-strategy to post, and I'm sure continuing, to understand what those factors were that describe for each individual in the business and therefore an aggregate view for the business in each of those locations, what a great workplace looked like both in the past and what they would imagine and hope for in the future. We went to a great deal of detail, including geographic mapping of people's home addresses. And we told our workforce we were doing this. We said we would be plotting every single person within our organization on a map and determining an average distance to office, an average travel time. And that was also cut by cycling, walking. There were some very funny walking times for those further out, of course, car and public transport. And we brought those factors to bear too, which is to say, well, it's not just about people here today, but if we happen to move our office across the other side of town, well, does that limit our talent pool for those who are on the east or west, depending where you decide to put that office or where you decide to build or place your office and place a strategy? So there was a huge list. There was also basic questions about, once we got to the floor plate design, things like center core or side core designs, and what are the implications of that, what seemingly innocuous choice around the way the office flows and feels. And based on the strategy we'd built, based on the way we observed our people behaving, the habits they had built, and the way we needed workflows to radiate from outward, we determined we needed a side core. A center core, or a donut, as it may seem on paper, was not actually going to work for the space we were seeking to build. So a side core was very favorable. And we essentially wiped out any center core options that were on our list. So we went through lots and lots of these individual factors or these collective factors around the space itself and the types of layout of the floor plates, the transportation options and elements required for our people to access the office easily, even to the point of, well, if they're only coming in 2 or 3 days a week, does that mean they'll travel further or less far? Or will there be a willingness to stretch that trips ever so slightly? And we had to go through each of those in multiple consultation periods with our workforce, with our executive team, and then therefore to form that broader strategy, which defined ultimately the types of spaces we're seeking, the types of technology, types of leadership behaviors that were there, therefore enabled that space to be successful.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because it is such a holistic process and there's so much to consider before we even start putting a pen on a paper and going, this is what we want our workplace itself to actually look like. And I find it really interesting that you identified that the side core was actually going to be a better option for you. And I agree. I recommend side cores to my clients as well for exactly that reason. It actually, a centralized core increases circulation space, makes your floor plate less efficient, but it also segregates your team into silos effectively because you end up divided by this built structure. Whereas with a side core, you have that clear space that you can create that connectivity with everyone. So there are some really key benefits in terms of how that all comes together. And applying those core drivers then to the market conditions and then looking at what you wanted, what were some other factors that really influenced the decision-making process around this? Because this isn't purely as we've already identified, you guys looked at this from the design of work before you started looking at it in terms of the design of place. Now, that's all well and good to say on paper, but there are some really key factors that either make or break this whole process because, just determining that we're going to work differently and therefore we're going to build a space that's going to enable people to work differently doesn't mean that they will work differently. There are multiple factors that come into this, from leadership capability to the way that our processes are structured, the way that we recruit, the way that we onboard, and then the way that we actually onboard people into the space and how they use that space. What were some of the challenges that you had there in terms of trying to understand that, communicate that, and then prepare and implement for that?
Yeah, I think leadership behavior is the central piece here. And I think it's very evident when you observe different environments which have very different models, whether it be a hybrid model or an all-in-office model. I mean, fundamentally, you need to start with why we're doing this. And I think engaging your employees early is critical. But it's not just engaging early, it's those points of reinforcement throughout the experience once it's even been brought to life. Exactly as you say, you might say as a business, cool, we're going to a hybrid model. That means 2 in and 3 out, or 3 in and 2 out, whatever it might be. But the reality is, if you haven't considered the habits and rituals of teams, the way teams work day to day, and the differences between ways of working for teams, you can't just turn and say, this is how it's going to be, now comply. Because what you end up with is chaos. So there needs to be a pull and push between what will the organization decide are set rules? What will be true for all? What is a global rule set? And frankly, trying to keep that list as small as possible. I think one of the examples I'll use is the hybrid working model. So I think as an organization, I don't think it's unfair for an organization to select the hybrid model that suits them and their industry type. And most organizations, whether they be in tech, professional service, and dozens of other potential environments, and I'm assuming knowledge-based working too, not customer-facing day-to-day, not hands-on the tools working, which requires you to be on site. I'm talking about knowledge-based workplaces particularly. I think most we're seeing are sort of in that 2 to 3 in or out type model. But where it often goes wrong is there's a lack of definition or ownership locally around how that plays out in practice. So you might say, as a business, you must be in the office 2 days a week. Well, what does that mean? Have you actually had a conversation with people to help unpack and understand that? How much control and influence do they have over when those 2 days are or how that works? Because I think in the absence of the why and the team defining when, you do end up with chaos. Well, it's to say, well, let's say we've got 20 members of a team. We have to all be in 2 days a week. Well, if those 20 members come in on different days, then what value does that add to that team's cohesion, that ability to collaborate, to learn socially with one another, to build a stronger team? Whereas if you then introduce anchor days, for instance, where a team then decides, and you leave it in the hands of the team to decide the optimal day for them, and you say, cool, we want everyone in 2 days a week, but at least once a week, we want every team to choose an anchor day that's best suited to them. And again, putting that power in the hands of the individual team. So yes, there are certain things that need to be set as a global rule set, but keeping them as broad as possible to give the choice to the individuals. And I suppose where this leads me is leadership. Once again, which is, do you have the courage of leadership, the trust in your organization to do that? And fundamentally, do you have people managers and leaders in the front line who know how to sustain those habits and rituals, who can apply and contextualize those rituals and those rules? And I think once you have both of those working in tandem, where there's high trust and high enablement from a leadership team and executive team, but also the competency of people managers and leaders in the front line to be able to actualize those rituals. And when I talk about those rituals, I'm talking about one-on-ones, having great one-on-ones and asynchronous working capabilities, setting clear objectives and goals and expectations when we're not physically together to look over each other's shoulders. I'm talking about conducting efficient, high-quality meetings when we are in person or remote, leveraging the value of time in person, because we know when we're in person, there are certain things that are just better. Getting to know people is better in person. I'm an extrovert, so of course I'm going to say that. And I have a preference to gather my energy from being around people. So I feel fueled and energized by social events and talking out loud to think through my thoughts. Others might disagree, and that's fine. But that's why it's important that we allow individuals and teams to make those decisions that are best for them. But when they're together, what works well together? And not leadership telling you what that is, but teams defining what that is. Sort of local social contracts, which are built around these new rituals and habits that are maintained by the collective team, rather than one leader or one manager saying, this is how it's going to be. We're going to be in Tuesday to Thursday every week, and we're all going to be together on Wednesday to have our big team meetings. Too bad. That's how it's like. It doesn't work, because people's energies, their focuses fluctuate, and not just day to day, but hour by hour. So we need to bake in as much flexibility and freedom of choice as possible within reason. And I think the thing that keeps that sustainable, that reduces the chaos, you can't get rid of it, but significantly reduces the chaos, is great leadership and great people management fundamentals.
Are you ready to transform your workplace and inspire the human potential in your business? Then why not book in a complimentary strategy call with me? We'll uncover where you are and where you want to be, and the opportunity that lay before you to ensure that you are preparing your workplace to adapt to any future. Just head over to my website, melissamarsden.com.au, or to the link in the show notes to book in your call. I look forward to chatting with you soon. So you're essentially empowering your leaders to then work with their teams to come up with routines and rituals that are going to work for them. So they're then determining what their anchor days are, but then they're also then determining what those anchor days consist of. What does it look like on that particular day? What are we coming in here? What are we going to expect? How are we going to engage? What value is this actually, returning to me for coming in and making myself available to the rest of my team on this particular day?
Yeah, exactly. And not just returning to me, but through that individual success and that sense of connectedness and the value of that performance to the whole as well. I mean, it's not a purely selfish thing. I don't go out into the world and do this human-centered design stuff to say everyone individually is going to be happy that the business is going to flop. What I'm saying is this is mutually beneficial. If you have people who feel and are at their best, performing at their best, then they're going to be contributing more as an individual to the collective. And therefore, the team as a whole will be fueled. It's this virtuous cycle we can generate when people genuinely feel like they belong and they're well, and they have a decent enough degree of control over their environment that they feel empowered rather than pushed. And I think once you get to that, it delivers immense value to the business as much as to the individual. It's very much a mutually beneficial outcome.
And so once you had this real clarity around the way that work happens and the way that these teams are going to interact and sort of ebb and flow through the space, how did that then inform the actual design of the space and, what you then provided as the tools of trade for your people to engage with and utilize when they actually came into the workspace?
Once we've captured what we understood to be those sort of core habits and providing flexibility for those habits, as you say, it then comes down to, well, what is the physical space that technologies are required to sustain that? And I'll put leadership capability to the side for one piece because we sort of touched on that, and we just assume that good people management, good leadership, effective leadership is what sort of sustains this around with the right space and the right technology stacks. But it is that. So once you understand those habits and flows, you can start to map out how you think people will use the spaces. I think one of the very simple examples is also not assuming that every team's the same. There was one fundamental difference that sort of smacked us in the face at Redbubble that we didn't get too late. It just, as someone who's not a tech person, it's not something I had personally considered, but through consultation, we identified that something as simple as the size of the desk and how many screens someone coding or developing might requires a different neighborhood. Standing desks for team huddles and stand-ups in the mornings, things that are so common for agile software development and the way agile teams work. We hadn't factored that early on, but it was something we gathered through that consultation process. So it was also thinking through, well, it's not just a side call that's going to benefit because we want people to flow through the space based on certain behaviors that are focused, and people who move to a quiet corner, a space is designed for that. People who move towards collaborative spaces with their team to do things that are a bit louder, but a space that is acoustically sound and positioned to allow for that without bleeding too far into other focused spaces, and social spaces we all meet and gather, sort of town hall spaces. But then it comes down to, as I said, the furnishings and the actual furniture. We determined that we needed bigger desks than we initially planned. We determined that we needed more screens for pods for tech teams and for engineering teams because that's what they needed, screens that rotated to allow one to remain horizontal and another to be portrait so they could code down one side and view on the other. And this is when you sort of get into the sort of the minutiae of things and down to picking colors of chairs. And does that have to be an acoustic couch or not an acoustic couch? But because we had all the data around habits and behavior already sort of sitting there, we didn't have to go back out to everyone again and ask them, what do you need? It was, well, based on this habit, this ritual, this team behavior, well, we know the answer to that. So it actually made that tail end really efficient. And when we went through the design companies, the space strategy teams, and the agents for the actual spaces, they could throw a question at us and we would have an answer ready to go. It made that incredibly efficient. And it was the same when we viewed properties. We could actually visualize how the space would move and flow. And we could almost instantly, whether it was 2 or 3 or 4 of us from the project team going out to see a space for the first time, we could say, that's not going to work because this team won't be able to do X or Y. And this team won't be able to do, but this team could do this that we hadn't considered. So we can already visualize those habits and rituals being blocked or prevented by the physical space. And then, of course, there's the technology piece too, which is around other design decisions relating to, hoteling versus to whether you bring down the spaces to see proportionate team usage and software that allows for space booking that's easy to use, nice to use, not clunky or a pain in the ass. And there's a whole bunch of tech questions to be resolved there. People systems that reinforce good people management practice and behaviors asynchronously that allow people to continue working through these new patterns that we'd never seen before. And yeah, maybe we were working from home 1 day a week or even 2 in some cases, but none of us were out 5 days a week or more. And it certainly wasn't usual at that point in time that we were going to be out every week, 2 or 3 in or out. It's such a shift.
Yeah. And I like the fact that you use behaviors and rituals to start to inform the design process, because effectively that's what space is. It's a way to influence behavior and to influence performance, but you can do that consciously or you can do it unconsciously, which tends to be the way that most workplaces end up creating this. But, when we think about it, that transition, you guys have completely changed the way that your people are working. You've then completely changed the type of space that you're providing them to work within. No doubt there was quite a robust conversation and process of change that went around this to help guide that process, because we are creatures of habit. And if we don't communicate how we intend people to use this new space, they will revert to old habits and old ways of behaving. And, the space will guide some of that, but we'll still nest if we, want to have our own desk or there's other things. What did that communication process look like in terms of transitioning people from current state to this new state? What did that look like?
We ran a lot of open tables. So at every stage beyond the initial consultation stages where we were meeting with groups of employees and surveying heavily to understand the patterns of behaviors, when it came time to actually launch the spaces, we had, I think it was fortnightly open tables and essentially hype reels. I think because we had done such close consultation, we'd communicated so clearly the findings of that consultation, which was relatively consistent and, again, very much focused on enabling teams and individuals to maintain a high degree of control and influence over the way they worked. We weren't coming at this from a position of needing to defend the decision. That was the nicest thing, that in a lot of instances, and I'm sure other leaders have not had this joyful experience, that they come to it from a position of, well, we've made these decisions on behalf of our employees and our business. How do we make them take it? We didn't have that. We didn't have to have that conversation because the focus was we listened. We were very clear about when specific asks were out of scope or not necessarily possible, and there weren't many. I'm not going to use exact examples, but there are some pretty interesting asks people make.
I've been asked to put a helipad on the roof.
Yeah. Well, we weren't on the roof, so that could have been an interesting question. But there wasn't a great deal of dissent or disagreement across the workforce about what we were trying to achieve. If anything, there was just a great deal of excitement and joy and almost urgency around, can you bring it sooner? Can we have it now? So what we built the comms and change plan around was more around building appetite and excitement. So a lot of our comms was built around building hype, certainly introducing spaces as we ourselves had access. So I'd recall the wonderful Dom would take just his phone and do a walk through the space, and we would use that for the next hype session in Open Table. And with that Open Table, we'd use that to update everyone on design changes or decisions that have been made in that prior 2-week period to keep people up to date with everything that was happening, why it was happening, if something had to change, why. And there were good reasons for things to change. Like you'd find fundamentally an assumption you'd made was wrong because, there's a column there that we can't do anything with. Or someone pulled up a bit of carpet or flooring and said, oh, God, what is that? And that's a major issue for where that desk was going to be positioned or where that and so, there were things that we came across we weren't expecting. Nothing insurmountable, but we also were very clear about everything that was going to change from the initial plan because, you consult, you read back, you adapt, you make sure everyone's aligned, but then if things change, don't just assume they're going to be okay with it. Actually communicate it, talk about it. So when those things happened, and I can't think of a specific example, but we had these sessions quite regularly and we would openly share, this thing surprised us. It's not going to work out how we planned, so we have to change this in the floor plan. This bit of the kitchen has to move because there's something there that we can't actually work around. And broadly speaking, I think when you engage people like that in a bizarrely human way, it tends to be received very well and it tends to become a conversation rather than confrontational. It was a very enjoyable process. And as weeks went on and we got closer and closer to launch, and I wasn't there for the launch itself, unfortunately, but as we got closer through those hype and open table sessions, the excitement to be in there was palpable. So it wasn't some huge demand that, okay, next Wednesday we're moving, everyone grumbles and wanders out of the office and pack your boxes and away we go. No, there was a genuine sense of excitement. And when people walked in there, it was a sense of wonder seeing this incredible space. It was a very enjoyable process, very enjoyable. But I think the principles are still the same, which is even if you've decided as an executive team or leadership team, we're going to make more decisions, and the degree to which we're allowing people choice is perhaps less than Dan's currently talking about at Redbubble, which I could completely understand. You know, there are instances where that will be true. Explaining why and engaging people in that conversation is critical. And if you can get that listening piece right, then it makes the actualization, the living experience of it that much easier. People don't tend to debate too much when they know why. If you just say, this is what we're going to do and this is when it's happening, you're going to get some agitation, frustration. But if you can explain why you're doing it and the purpose, and then have a conversation, open, honest, human conversation about it, you can very quickly generate understanding.
I think that's fantastic advice, because I would 100% agree. You know, even if the executive team need to make some of those decisions, actually going through the process of inviting people's feedback and engaging them in the process. I'm not saying do it at a lip service or, you know, or falsities, actually taking that information on board and then looking at, well, based on the decisions that we're making it as an executive team, what are we able to actually accommodate from these ideas that our people have put forward, and what isn't possible? And then explain why it is and why it isn't. Because even just that two-way piece of communication goes a long way to actually helping people understand why we're doing things, what is possible, what's not possible, why it's not possible, and what that future vision is going to be for the business. And I've seen that time and time again. It's when I walk into organizations and they go, this is what we're doing, and all of a sudden there's a new fit out and they just pack everyone up and move them in, which is the way, you know, it used to happen that way, like quite a bit. And fortunately now that's not happening that way. But yeah, I think actually just having those conversations and communication is a massive piece of the whole puzzle.
Yeah. And I think fundamentally, if you don't have that conversation with people, you just get resistance.
Yeah.
And that doesn't help anybody. Even for organizations that are getting better at the we've found a new office, let's move together thing, they're still tripping over basic conversations. And I think the hybrid conversation is one of the best examples. Again, you have these businesses that are looking to move to 3 in, 2 out, or 2 in, 3 out, or whatever that model might be, or everyone come back full time. And they're providing these dictates, but they're not actually having the conversation of why it's critical to the business. And people are reasonable. Most people I deal with are very reasonable individuals. If you just engage them in that conversation, explain why that's important to the team, to the business, you can easily bring them on board. I think what a lot of businesses do is they stick with the what and they forget the why. And they really need to get better, engage people in that conversation, because I do hear stories from organizations who have communicated, we will be in the office 3 days. And that's sort of the degree of definition that's provided. And it ends up being chaos. And frankly, unless you're going to check everybody's badge access at the door and actually go through the badge logs and say, okay, this person was only in 2 out of 3, let's reprimand them for not coming that 3rd day. I mean, what are you going to do? What culture do you want to create? And this is where it comes back to behavior again. What culture and sense of belonging do you want to create with that, or lack of sense of belonging, do you want to create by chastising someone because they didn't meet your 3-day-a-week threshold? That arbitrary line that you have drawn without reasoning, without any sense of control from the individual, what is that going to do with respect to your turnover? What is it going to do with in terms of active engagement, or that lean towards passivity, or even active disengagement long term? You are going to end up with an incredibly disengaged workforce who are there for the paycheck, but they aren't delivering you a whole lot, because it actually tells that person either consciously or unconsciously who you are. And it sets the tone for that person, the degrees of trust that they can expect from you as an organization. And that, I think, is fundamental to the people experience. I know we start on behaviors, then we talk about structure and points of reinforcement, and we come back to behaviors, because fundamentally that's what it's all about, which is how do you want people to feel and how do you want them to show up in that space or that experience? And in the absence of that good thought and that process and that consultation, that discussion, you're just going to end up with disengaged people who turn and move. They're not going to stick with you.
No, they're not going to be there collecting that paycheck for very long. Look, I have loved our conversation today, Dan. This has been completely my jam. Happy to geek out with you on all of these things, because that's kind of how this whole conversation started. But look, the podcast is called Work Life by Design. So my parting question for you that I'd love to know is, how have you gone about designing your own work life? Like, what has been important to you in creating a work life that you love?
I think central to my work life is, do I have time to be genuinely present with my family and see my 2 young boys grow up and be with my partner, Sarah, to enjoy that time? And let's not confuse that with, oh, he's working from home, therefore not productive. For me, it comes down to optimizing each of my days. So my average working day a week couldn't be more different. And I will work early morning. I'll work late into the afternoon and evening to get my outcomes achieved, hopefully exceeded, being my typical goal. But it fundamentally comes down to, not do I have a balance, but am I blending this thing right today? Have I blended it right this week, this month? And where I feel that gap in my heart, because I haven't blended it right, I haven't spent sufficient time focusing on family and home, even if I might be located within the walls of my family home and house, then it needs adjusting. Because like all things, if you burn one thing in the absence of another, you burn out. So for me, productivity, happiness is when I'm blending that just right in the given circumstance and time. It's an ever-moving target, never ever truly getting it perfectly right, but just trying to find that sort of optimal blend of all things all at once whilst loving the work that I do, which I do.
More great advice. Thank you, Dan. And look, I couldn't agree with you more. It is very much about blending it, and that blend looks different every day and every week depending on what's going on in life. But like you said, I think I share a similar value there in the fact that I used to think, working hard and doing all this, I'm doing it for my family. But if I'm not there for my family, then it's kind of a bit pointless, and that's not the things that they remember. So being there and being a present mum and being part of that and making sure that blend looks better, I think it's a better outcome for me anyway.
I would hope that for everybody, yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, look, thank you so much for joining me today. Absolutely loved our conversation. If people want to get in touch with you or learn more about what you do, how can they connect with you?
Yeah, hit me up on LinkedIn, easily searchable, Daniel Mottau or Dan Mottau. I'm always happy to geek out with people, so I would love if people would just get into contact.
Wonderful. All right, well, we'll pop all of your details in the show notes, and thanks so much for today.
Thanks, Mel. It's been a pleasure.